Today's podcast of Hellbent for Horror is brought to you by Audible.com. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/Hellbent for Horror. Audible has over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. Hi, and welcome to episode 1 of Hellbent for Horror. It's a podcast devoted to all things related to horror. I'm S.A. Bradley, and I'm a lifelong movie lover. I love all types of movies and literature, but my heart always goes back to horror. If there's a choice between two types of movies, and one of the choices is a horror movie, 90% of the time I pick the horror one. It's just the way I'm wired. I like underdogs. Now, about this podcast, the door swings wide here. We're going to cover a large range of topics on this show because we live in an amazing time where so many different eras and styles of horror are available to anyone who's curious. You can find just about anything now. And I've been curious my whole life, so I want to talk about as many of them as possible, as well as the subcultures that have sprung up from them. I'm going to be covering movies, books, music, campfire tales, going to conventions, whatever it takes to tell a compelling story. Because really, my biggest thrill is getting to talk to people about this stuff. I want to start conversations with you. I want to talk to my fellow obsessives. I want to talk to obsessives in training. I want to talk to those who just saw the first horror movie that really got to them, and they can't shake that feeling. I really want to talk to you because, welcome, you just caught the bug. And that's what I want to talk about today. It's the unifying experience, what we all have in common, no matter what kind of horror style we like, because it all has to start somewhere, and each of us has had an experience so strong that it keeps us watching and reading horror long after our teenage years are over. I mean, there's a reason we keep coming back to the plate. We do it even when we have to slog through a dozen crappy movies just to see one good one. We're hooked. Now, I call that reason the first kiss. So what's the first kiss? I don't have a textbook definition, but I think of it as a moment when whatever it is that you're watching or you're reading or you're listening to gives you a feeling that's so intense that it feels like it was all written or made just for you, for that moment in your life. It's like up until that moment, you've been wearing everybody else's hand-me-downs. But this thing, this is yours. It's personal. It's liberating. So, liberating, interesting. What were you being liberated from? Well, for me, I was being liberated from a protective world that was carefully created for me. That protective world was intentional and necessary. But sooner or later, you notice cracks appearing in this safe illusion. The wallpaper starts to peel. For me, horror was the thumbnail, picking and scratching at that peeling wallpaper. Now, liberation can be scary. It can be upsetting. But when it works, it is exhilarating. My first kiss was all three. But the exhilaration, I wanted that again. I've been chasing that first kiss for a long time now, and every so often I get close. But it's never like the intensity of that first discovery of a more dangerous, forbidden, seductive world. I think that that's part of the appeal of horror, the feeling of unease that jumping into familiar, or actually unfamiliar territory gives you, especially if it feels like you're breaking a few rules to get there. So what was life like pre-liberation? Well, for most of us, our parents created that protective world. That's how it was for me, and that meant that my parents made a lot of choices for me. Now, if you're a movie lover like I am, that means they also made the choices of what I was able to watch, and that's an important point. My first kiss is not about the first time I just got scared by something I watched. I'll bet good money that most kids in the United States probably got scared by The Wicked Witch of the West and The Wizard of Oz or the flying monkeys that are there, or they got scared by The Wicked Stepmother and Snow White or whatever else Disney had in bad guys. But to me, those scares wash off really easy, even for little children, because those scares are really more in service to a bigger moral, a bigger picture, and that picture is safe, and in the end, it's life-affirming. It's not very scary. That's because the horror you're getting at that time, it's really parent-approved horror. It's court-appointed horror. The experience is really only going to go so far. These people don't want you getting too freaked out. They have to put you to sleep later. So, if you're a movie lover as a kid like me, and you're sucking up everything you see, parents are very important in what they're actually giving you. So they're kind of like deans to your first film school. They're going to tell you what you can actually watch. It's the first film school you're going to attend. They pick the curriculum. They get to tell you if you're advanced enough to go on to the next level. My dad would be my horror teacher, so I inherited his films. He loved the atomic age horror movies of the 1950s, and I saw a lot of them. In fact, I saw Them, the giant ants, and Tarantula, and a lot of atomic age nightmares. I also saw Howard Hawks' The Thing from Another World. By the way, I love all those films to this day, but they aren't mine. So if your parents are creating a protective world for you, and they're also the deans of your first film school, I mean, something has to happen to get to that next level. Well, something has to happen to get to the next film school. So something has to sneak through their defenses. So the first film school is run by your parents. The next film school finds you. So what your next film school was probably depends on what generation you belong to, but they all have one thing in common. They snuck through the parent defenses in plain sight, and by the time the danger was recognized, it was too late. So if you're a baby boomer, your film school was either television by way of the Shock Theater package or comic books by way of EC Comics. So very briefly, television was new and innocuous in the late 50s. Universal Studios syndicated their classic horror films, and they sold that to local TV stations across the United States. So around 1957, hundreds of TV stations all came up with the same ideas, and they created a weekly horror show devoted to classic Universal monsters. So what happens is television's innocuous, but scary monsters snuck onto TV, and kids are sneaking downstairs at night to watch these shows. Rules were being broken. In the same way, comic books were considered kiddie fare, and they weren't taken seriously. Then William Gaines creates notoriously violent horror comics with the names of Tales from the Crypt and Vault of Horror. So when parents finally saw what Johnny was reading, because of course they thought comic books were relatively innocent, it created a national hysteria, and it was actually known as Seduction of the Innocent. There was a great paper on that. Probably talk about that later. So for baby boomers that are into horror, what I'm saying is there were two major influences that gave a lot of people their first kiss. So that's one generation. And by the way, I'm going to be talking about Creature Features, EC Comics, Phenomena horror hosts in future podcasts. Now, talking about other film schools, normally people tend to say that the next generation's film school was the home video market and video stores, but that doesn't really take hold until the early 1980s. What about cusp kids like me, one foot in baby boomer, another foot in that 80s time? So the film school of the early 1970s, my film school, and my great corruptor, and where I got my first kiss, was cable television. More specifically, the original home box office. So I'm not talking HBO as it's known now, with multiple Emmys and big blockbusters and The Sopranos and Game of Thrones, and there's a level of respectability. I'm talking about the early, oh my gosh, is anybody going to watch this? We'll put anything on if anybody will watch time. Early in their time, when they're desperate. So home box office started in Manhattan, and they weren't doing very well, so to increase subscriptions, they had families in northeastern Pennsylvania basically beta testing the service, and the service was movies are going to be shown uncut and interrupted by commercials on TV. But of course, TV was free at that time, so the idea was met with a lot of skepticism. So once again, it's not being taken very seriously. Now, I grew up in northeast Pennsylvania, and I was lucky to be exposed to the very early days of home box office. So in the summer of 1974, I had one hell of a freshman year in film school. So this was Wild West pioneer time with HBO. No rules. They put anything on there. And the service was only on for about 9 hours a day. But in that 9 hours, I got to see movies, great B movies like The Poseidon Adventure, Dirty Mary, Crazy Larry, White Lightning, The Life and Times of Judge Roy Bean, The 7-Ups, Sam Peckinpah's The Getaway, The Stone Killer. These were movies that were not going to be child's fare. You would have to go to the drive-in to see a lot of these, and my parents were going to take me there for these. So this was like a wow splash in the face. There's blood, there's bullets, there's cursing, there's women in tight T-shirts. Doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize I'm going to get hooked. And just like the baby boomer film schools, at first nobody realized what was really going on. It's television, and the impact of it was underestimated. Of course, there was another reason, a personal reason, that it took a while for my parents to realize what was going on right under their noses. At that time, my parents were in process of divorcing. I was not the center of their attention, so I was unsupervised, and the television kept me out of sight. Even though I didn't know exactly what was happening in my world, it was registering emotionally that something was wrong. I was a very anxious kid. I didn't sleep well. And I was already pretty obsessive, and I really became very obsessed and focused on what was on home box office. It was only on, like I said, 9 hours a day, so the rest of the time the channel had a continuously scrolling movie schedule, and they had jazz music playing behind it, so it was kind of like always there, and it was always background as well. And I ended up watching that scrolling schedule habitually. I was reading all the movie details, running times, plot summaries. I was burying myself. I was losing myself. Because I knew every so often, maybe every hour, they would show trailers for the movies on the service. They'd also show coming attractions of what was coming. They were exciting and they broke the monotony. And this is when I got my first kiss. I wasn't looking for it. I was definitely unprepared. My first kiss was a coming attraction for Nicholas Roeg's 1973 movie, Don't Look Now. It stars Donald Sutherland and Julie Christie as a husband and wife who suffer a tragedy that leads them on to supernatural elements. I will get back to that. Now, Nicholas Roeg isn't a name that springs to mind for horror fans, and it is humorous to me that this movie, out of all the legendary horror movies that I can name that I've seen, this was the one that was going to send me on a lifelong obsession. In fact, I'm sure critics don't even call Don't Look Now a horror film, even though it certainly has all of the elements that are necessary. They'll stop at like supernatural thriller or something like that. Nicholas Roeg, he was at his most popular in the 1970s, and he's considered kind of a cult figure with art film aspirations. He started as a cameraman, and his movies are celebrated by people like Ridley Scott for the foreboding sense of atmosphere that he created with how he shot scenes. He was definitely a master of how to manipulate the image. And he was known for using powerful images, but he was also known for a nonlinear plot line. He would tell stories in a nonlinear fashion. So his movies were like anxiety-filled puzzles that usually came into focus in the final shots, what the whole thing was about. And I think that was frustrating for a lot of people and why he's not a mainstream guy. But I think it's that style that really went deep to the center of me at that moment. As a child, I was more in tune with visual images than narrative storytelling, and I had an overactive imagination. Roeg's pure cinema style of telling a story and the way he showed those images hit hard. So bear in mind, most of my visual language of films and TV was up until that point from the 50s. And that stuff always had really bright stage lighting and things were posed in a certain way, framing looked a certain way. This, Nicholas Roeg's film, did not look like a movie. It looked real, like outside real. I think the clip that I saw on Home Box Office was culled together the first few minutes of the movie. If you've seen the film, you know it starts abruptly. The first shot is in the English countryside, and we see a little girl in a red raincoat. She's playing around with a wheelbarrow in the grass. There is some music. There's a lone, sparse piano playing lightly on the soundtrack. It is odd. You know, it's registering with me. We're seeing this girl all alone. We don't know where she is. There's been no discussion. It's then revealed that she's out playing on the land of a large English home. It sits on small hills. There's a pond there. It's very wet and wintry. Everything's a little misty. And then we see a shot of a boy older than her. He's riding his bicycle around trees on the property. He's probably her brother. Then we see the girl walking alone, carrying a little talking doll. Now, Nicholas Roeg shoots this image so that the sun is going directly into the camera lens. And that makes the girl into a shadowy figure. The camera's also set low to the ground. Because of that, she's distorted in size. And she's a little girl, so she's walking weird. She's trudging through twigs and weeds, and they're obscuring her. I don't know why yet, but as a child, I'm starting to get nervous. There's a red ball in the foreground, and she reaches down, she picks it up, and she throws it. We see that the ball lands in a nearby pond. We see her walk out on a small embankment on the water. The water's underneath her to get this ball. She leans over. She's stretching out her arm, her little body leaning forward. We cut back to the boy on the bicycle. He is oblivious to everything. He's speeding around the trees. He's picking up twigs and throwing them. We go back to the girl. She's still reaching out. In the background, we see the house. I'm thinking she seems so far away from it. It's so far. There's no sound except for the little trill of piano every so often. At that point, the camera pans down to the water, and all we see is the girl reflected in it. There's a loud crow that caws, and the music just cuts off. Now all of a sudden we're inside the house. Mother and father in the den. Mother's reading a book. It's very quiet. There are only natural sounds of a fireplace that's there. The father, now that's Donald Sutherland, he's using a slide projector to look at slides of the interior of a Gothic church with a large stained glass window over the altar. As he's looking at one of the slides, something catches his eye. And the picture that we see, this slide itself, is a little ominous. It's shot low from the floor of the church to be able to catch all the stained glass window. So the pews are distorted in size. They look really menacing and shadowy. There's a lot of shadows in this. In one of the pews in this picture, there's a figure in a hooded red raincoat, also distorted in size. We can only see the back of the hood hunched forward. He takes the slide out of the projector, he puts it in a light box under a magnifier to look at it a little bit closer. Under that magnifier, everything is even more distorted. There's only the sound of the fan on the slide projector. I'm taking this in. I'm getting anxious, and I don't know why. We cut back outside. We see the girl. She's no longer on this pier, but we only see her reflection off the pond. She's upside down. And in the reflection, we see that she's walking on the bank of the pond with this ball in her hand again. The only thing we hear are her footsteps, the sounds of birds. She starts running and jumping. The camera is trying to keep up with her reflection, upside down. We cut to the boy on his bicycle. He speeds up as he passes the camera. There's a quick cut to the girl's foot landing in a big puddle, and at the same moment, the boy runs over a pane of glass that's been hidden in the grass. It's shining like a mirror. He's thrown from the bike. We cut to the father. He jerks his head up as if he just heard something. Now Rogue cuts to a shot of a cigarette burning in an ashtray right next to dirty dishes and unfinished food that's on the dinner table. The camera sits on that shot of the smoke wisping up from the cigarettes for a long time. Too long. The tension is building. Why are we looking at this? What is happening to the kids? We cut to the mother searching for her cigarettes. She's picking up pillows on the couch. We cut back outside and we see the boy checking the tires on his bicycle. We hear the little girl's talking doll. He looks behind him and we see her standing at the edge of the pond. She seems very far away. He cuts his finger on the glass in the tire. We cut back to the house and the father is reaching over the light box to fetch the cigarettes. He tosses them to his wife. There's a quick cut to the little girl at the edge of the pond throwing the ball. It lands in the water. At the same time, there's a cut to the father knocking a glass of water onto the slide on the light box. He rushes over with a towel and he tries to dry it. We cut to a shot of the ball in the pond, spinning silently. We cut back to the father, looking under the magnifier to see if there was any damage to the slide. We look at the slide through the magnifier, and what happens made my throat clamp up. The head of the red-hooded figure begins to distort, and it looks like a red tendril is beginning to stretch out of it towards the stained glass. It's like a ghostly finger. It's blood red and black, and it keeps growing out. Now, what we're seeing in reality is the emulsion disintegrating on the slide because of the moisture. But what I was seeing, feeling in my heart, was something evil being born, something horrible. The father looks up, horrified, as if he's feeling what I'm feeling. Something is wrong. We see a shot of the boy running fast towards the house. There's no sound. The father runs outside. We cut to a slow-motion shot of the girl in the pond, under the water, face up, eyes closed, sinking. We see her face disappearing into the darkness below. The boy is running towards the house. He's yelling, "Dad, Dad, Dad." He slips and falls on the wet ground. He lands on the hill around the house. The father is running down the hill. Now Sutherland's body is compressing at the impact of hitting this uneven land of the hill. He's falling forward more than he's running. He looks pale, like he already knows. The red ball floats in the water. He staggers into the water, and he pushes himself forward, pushes himself to where he saw his daughter sink. The boy is on the land watching, blood on his fingers, shard of glass in his hands. The father takes a horrified breath and dives under the water. Inside the house, the mother's looking at the ruined slide. The hooded figure now is completely gone. There's only this expanding blob, and it's pulsing red. Up until now, there's been no music. Just the sound of birds and natural sounds, no dialogue. Up until now. While we look at the slide, there's this unholy whooshing sound, like thunder in reverse. And then there's this loud, deep strain of cellos that plays music so deep that it sounds like pure evil. The red tendril suddenly explodes into life. It's growing. It's moving like it's alive. It's circling the stained glass. In my kid's mind, it was pure evil. This evil was loose in God's house, and it was winning. The next shot is the one that truly terrified me. This was my kiss. So Nicholas Roeg shoots this scene at the pond in the dark now, with a bright light on Donald Sutherland, and it's not done as a day for night or anything. It's not it's not meant to be nighttime. It is purely done for impact and mood. So the light, this bright light, is on Donald Sutherland as he rises out from the water with his dead girl in his arms. This makes everything else outside of the daughter and the father fall off into darkness. He shot this. Roeg shot it in slow motion, and the bright light makes the water splash up and look like glass, and there are shadows falling everywhere. This has all the qualities of my real nightmares. Donald Sutherland's hair is matted over his face. The only part of him you can see is the open O of his mouth as he lets out a moan that made me cover my ears. The sheer grief, the slow motion, the shadows, the lifeless girl terrifies me. I'm completely in shock and I'm trembling. I need to go outside. No matter where I go, I can't get these images out of my head. I have no idea why I'm so shaken. It affects me more than I know. My father tells me that for the next 2 days in a row, he wakes me from nightmares where I'm saying, she's dead, she's dead. Why did it affect me so much? Well, it could be that the emotions and situations being shown were just way too adult in theme for my child mind to process correctly. Maybe Nicholas Roeg did his job extremely well, and I just caught everything he wanted to convey. And maybe it was because I was seeing a family being destroyed, and fathers couldn't stop it from happening. And it could happen anywhere, even when you felt safe. And it could happen in an instant. Evil could wrap its tendrils around your life and just smother it. So it was personal for me, very scary and uncomfortable. And this is where most kids would turn the channel. I had to watch it again. And that's my first kiss. I'd love to hear what your first kiss is. You can definitely get in touch with me. I look forward to any conversations that we might have. Hellbent for Horror will be available through iTunes and Stitcher, as well as my website, hellbentforhorror.com. That's all one word. You can find the Hellbent for Horror Facebook page link on there as well. You can get in touch with me by way of the Facebook page. You can just leave something on the website. You can also email me at Scott, that's 2 T's, at hellbentforhorror.com. And you can follow me on Twitter at hellbenthorror. This episode of Hellbent for Horror was written and performed by S.A. Bradley and produced by Lisa Gorski. Thanks for listening. I look forward to the conversations. Stay hellbent.